One of the biggest problems we can have with our guppies is when we look into the tank and we see them all up gasping at the surface. In my experience, there are three main reasons guppies will be gasping at the surface of their aquarium. And in this video, I'm going to share all three with you and tell you what you can do to solve each problem. Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Richard and I'm a fish and shrimp keeper based in the UK. So first off, let's look at why guppies might be gasping at the surface and then look into what could be causing it. Much like us, our fish breathe oxygen. Now they don't breathe oxygen from the air as we do, they absorb it from the water through their gills. They essentially absorb oxygen directly through the water by passing it through their gills. And as they do, as they take in the oxygen, they expel carbon dioxide, much in the same way we do. Now oxygen dissolves in the water at the surface. Essentially, surface movement allows dissolved carbon dioxide to leave the aquarium water and oxygen from the air above to be dissolved into the water, allowing our fish to breathe. Now, at first sight, it might look like the guppies are trying to get air from above. They look like they're trying to suck the air in. But in fact, the way our aquariums work is the highest level of dissolved oxygen is near the surface and the lowest levels of dissolved oxygen are right down at the substrate. This explains why the fish will be up at the surface when they're struggling to breathe, because the surface is where there is the most dissolved oxygen. So let's look at the three main reasons our guppies might be up at the surface gasping for air. And reason number one, quite simply, is a lack of dissolved oxygen in the aquarium water. As mentioned previously, it's at the surface of the aquarium that the exchange of gases takes place. It's at the surface that carbon dioxide dissolved in the aquarium water can leave into the atmosphere above, and oxygen from the atmosphere above the water gets dissolved into the aquarium water. Now, for that to take place, there needs to be surface movement. Now, in nature, you find waterways everywhere from extremely fast-flowing rivers to literally stagnant pools of water with next to no movement, no surface movement whatsoever. And one of the main differences between these bodies of water is the amount of dissolved oxygen. In rivers where the water is really flowing, it's an absolute torrent and it's going across rocks and boulders and it's all white and frothy, there is typically a huge amount of dissolved oxygen due to all of that surface movement. And in smaller static bodies of water, like small ponds or pools that don't have hardly any surface movement at all, there tends to be far lower levels of dissolved oxygen. That's why fish like bettas and gouramis that evolved to live in these almost stagnant pools developed a method of breathing air from above. Our betta fish can actually breathe air from above the water. They had to develop that because the pools they live in have very low levels of dissolved oxygen. So if we know that surface movement dictates the amount of dissolved oxygen, it therefore stands to reason that if you have very little surface movement and you have a lot of fish living in your aquarium and those fish are absorbing much of the dissolved oxygen and there's not much surface movement to allow the carbon dioxide to escape and fresh oxygen to come in, it therefore stands to reason that the best way to solve that problem is to introduce surface movement. Now, in my experience, the absolute best way to create surface movement is with a simple air pump and air stone. Now, if you run a sponge filter, you will naturally end up with those bubbles going up. If you run an hang-on back filter or a canister filter, you may feel like you've got a huge amount of surface movement, but in fact, unless you set those filters up correctly, typically the water just cascades back into the tank without creating much movement on the surface. Even in aquariums where I run a canister filter or a hang-on back filter, I also run an air stone, and that is purely to create surface movement. Now, a lot of people do think it's the bubbles rising, dissolving in the water, and yes, that does happen, but it really is the amount of surface movement those bubbles create when they pop. So if you find your guppies are gasping at the surface, and when you look at your aquarium, you don't have a great deal of surface movement, try adding an air stone. You will almost certainly solve your problem overnight. Now, reason number two, you might find your guppies are gasping at the surface, and this can happen even if there's sufficient surface movement, is due to excess levels of ammonia, nitrites, and nitrates. Now, when our fish go to the bathroom, their waste is incredibly high in ammonia, and ammonia is toxic to fish. Now, luckily, there are strains of bacteria living in our aquariums, living in our filters, whose job it is to take that highly toxic ammonia and to convert it into the slightly less toxic nitrite. Now, nitrite, with an I, is still toxic to fish, but slightly less so than ammonia. Fortunately, however, there is another strain of bacteria living in our aquariums and living in our filters that converts the fairly toxic nitrite into the far less toxic nitrate, this time with an A. This is what we typically refer to as the nitrogen cycle. Now, we can occasionally end up with a spike in ammonia or a spike in nitrates or just excess levels of nitrates in our aquariums. And having raised levels of ammonia or nitrites or nitrates can irritate the gills of our guppies. And in fact, high levels of ammonia can literally burn their gills and make it really difficult for them to extract oxygen from the aquarium water. So if you look into your guppy tank and you've got lots of surface movement and yet they're still up at the surface, the best thing you can do is test your water for ammonia, nitrites, and nitrates. And if you find you have elevated levels, carry out a large partial water change. In fact, if I tested my aquarium and I found I had a high level of ammonia, I would probably do a 50 or 60% water change there and then. If I had high levels of nitrite or nitrate, I would probably carry out a 30 or 40% water change. The best thing you can do is drain down as much of the water with the high ammonia or nitrites or nitrates and replace it with fresh, dechlorinated tap water. Now, the third reason you might find your guppies are gasping at the surface, and this can be the case if you have plenty of surface movement and you've tested your water and there are no particularly high levels of any of the three, and this can be a pest or a parasite living in the gills of your guppies. And one of the most common pests we find are gill flukes, and gill flukes live in the gills of our fish and they really irritate the fish. You may notice that not only are your guppies gasping at the surface, but they're perhaps rubbing themselves on rocks or substrate. They're literally trying to scratch the itch on their gills. If you ever look into your tank and you see your guppies constantly doing this, they sometimes call it flashing. They're constantly doing this on the substrate, on the rocks, on the plants. It may be that something like a pest or a disease is irritating their gills. Now, there isn't really a one cure solves all because you need to know what's wrong with your fish, and it will depend what country you live in as to what treatment you might use. The best thing you can do is to contact a local store or a local breeder and explain the problem you're having and ask what they might use. Now, I live in the UK and I use a product called Escher G-Dex, and that deals with all kinds of skin and gill flukes for our fish. If you're in the US, you might use a product called Paracleanse from Fritz. And depending on where you live in the world, you need to source the correct treatment for, if you look for a treatment that solves gill flukes or gill parasites, that should be able to help. Seeing guppies gasping at the surface can be distressing. But if we look, have we got sufficient surface movement? Do we have raised levels of ammonia, nitrites or nitrates? Could the fish be suffering from a parasite like gill flukes? By going through the list and addressing each one at a time, we should be able to quite quickly bring relief to our guppies and stop them gasping at the surface. Now, I don't know about you, but I love keeping and breeding guppies. And I recently shared a video explaining how I go about growing my guppy fry faster. And you can watch that video next. Thanks for watching.